officer specializing in counterintelligence and human intelligence, serving all over the world, specializing in the Asia Pacific region. With me today, I am very, very happy to be talking again with Mike McLaughlin, an associate and policy advisor at Baker, Donelson, Bierman, Caldwell, and Berkowitz, or Baker Donelson for short, who also works here in Washington, D.C. Mike also comes from a military background, having spent time in the U.S. Navy, serving as the senior counterintelligence advisor to the commander of U.S. Cyber Command. Mike, it's so great to have you with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve.
So today we're talking about war in Ukraine, the impact on cyber warfare writ large, and implications to the security of U.S. critical infrastructure. We're going to be covering such topics as what role cyber operations have played in the war up until now, how those operations have changed cyber activities targeting the U.S., impacts to the security of American critical infrastructure. We're going to do a quick comparison of Russian cyber activities with those of China, Iran, and North Korea. We're going to talk about how all of these actions and activities have impacted the world of cyber insurance within the United States. We're going to talk about how the US government is looking to mitigate this new and evolving threat environment. And then we'll culminate talking about what's next in the post-Ukraine war environment. What does that cyber space look like, specifically for American critical infrastructure? So to kick it off, we'll kind of rewind the timeline back to February 24th of 2022. The Russians have just begun their invasion across the Ukrainian border, and speculation at the time was that Moscow would leverage a robust cyber, electromagnetic, and other advanced warfare capabilities to cripple the command, control, communications, and computers of the Ukrainian forces they were facing. But that isn't really how it played out at all. Mike, I was wondering if you could break down what actually happened and why Russian activities didn't really align with our expectations prior to.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. And so this is interesting. I was actually at US Cyber Command when we were looking at this in the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it was certainly a tense time. Russian cyber attacks actually kicked off about a month before the Russian ground forces invaded in February of last year. You had diplomatic talks that were going on between the government of Russia and the government of Ukraine that really broke down in mid-January. And that's when the road to war really started. And it started with Russian cyber actors starting to take aim at Ukrainian government and critical infrastructure networks. These include defacement of Ukrainian government websites, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Education, but also we saw the deployment of wiperware, which is something that we knew the Russians had the capability of doing, but hadn't really deployed in mass before this. And the deployment was of Whispergate, which Microsoft first identified. And Whispergate was a wiper that, as the name implies, wipes databases and leaves no means of recovery. And so whereas ransomware, you have encryption or you have the exfiltration of data and you're trying to turn that over to give that back to the owner in exchange for monetary exchange, Bitcoin, something like that. In this case, all Whispergate did was wipe the databases and make it so they were irrecoverable. These types of harassing attacks continued really up to and through the Russian ground invasion. But then if you looked at like an attack over time chart, you would see it would drop off dramatically after about February of last year. And that's the strange thing, where most experts, including experts within US Cybercom and within the US government, they expected the Russian cyber actors to really ramp up operations coincident with military operations. The opposite actually occurred. So in January and February of last year, Russian cyber activities against Ukrainian critical infrastructure peaked. And this is due, I think, to several factors. But really, it comes down to one. The Russians no longer needed to use cyber operations in the way that they did before. And so cyber operations are best used when they're cloaked in deniability, meaning you want to conduct a cyber operation in lieu of a kinetic operation because you want to hide your hand in that operation. And now that Russia invaded and they had forces actually on the ground, they didn't need to hide their hand anymore. And so what we saw, instead of conducting destructive cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, the Russians instead opted for missiles and kamikaze drones and actually physically attacked those same critical infrastructure, those infrastructure nodes and those companies and those services. And so really what we've come to see instead is that you have Russian cyber attacks are being used as almost coordinated fires, to use a Marine Corps term there for you, but coordinated fires with other types of military operations. And in this way, you have Russian cyber capabilities shifting from being mostly destructive to being more standalone weapons, destructive standalone weapons, to playing more of a supporting role to other combat capabilities. And we've seen it as the war has progressed, has become more and more the case where destructive cyber attacks have gone down significantly, whereas destructive physical attacks and kinetic attacks have increased significantly. But Ukraine's experience in combating these types of cyber threats really provide valuable insights for the global community, and particularly for critical infrastructure owners and operators across the world and in the West, and really offer a glimpse into what the future of warfare is going to look like, where wars are fought through conventional means, and the borderless realm of cyberspace is almost an extension of the battlefield. And so that's where I think we're going, and why we've seen the startling, or I guess the surprising, use of cyber warfare having been curtailed as Russia invaded.
Not only do I love that you used a Marine Corps term of coordinated fires, I am very biased, as you might know, but I also think it's a great way to talk a little bit about, cyber as one of the pillars in offensive operations. And you talked about missile strikes as an alternative. Wanted to ask your opinion on, missile strikes have, I think, a more tested and validated escalation framework, if that makes sense. So, if Russia launches a missile here, the proportionate response is to launch one missile back. Do you think the reticence to go kind of harder and faster in the cyber domain from Moscow comes from that lack of escalation framework, where potentially the Kremlin was worried that specific cyber operations might bring the West into the war before the Russians wanted that to happen?
I think that's certainly part of it. The cyber operation we always point to as a mistake on the part of the Russians is NotPetya. And NotPetya occurred in 2017, where you had Russia targeting Linkos Group, which was a tax accounting software based in Kiev, but that serviced, think of it like TurboTax, it serviced all companies operating in Ukraine. Well, it also serviced multinational companies that were operating in Ukraine, companies like Maersk and Merck and Mondelez, and major global companies, and really brought them to their knees, causing something on the order of $10 billion worth of damage. Well, that never should have happened. The Russian team that conducted that operation should have realized that as soon as that malware spreads beyond the geographic border of Ukraine, that it was going to have spillover effects in the international community. And the international response to that were significant sanctions against Russia. That's something that we've seen the Russian cyber actors actually try to rein in a little bit. And so you no longer have these very wide scale, almost sloppy cyber attacks that are very broad in nature or affect a very broad user base. And instead, they're very tailored either to a very specific geographic location or to very specific networks in very specific companies or government organizations. And so I think the Russians have actually gotten pretty good at tailoring their operations such that they don't have that spillover effect, and that they know even before they launch the attack what the end battle damage assessment, to use another Marine Corps term there for you, what the end battle damage assessment is ultimately going to be. They've been pretty good at reining that in so far. I think the use of kinetic weapons, and certainly from an escalatory standpoint, they are more familiar with what that is ultimately going to entail. But by that same token, because they have been more tailored with their cyber operations, I think they can manage the escalation there as well. And so I think more than anything, and why we haven't seen cyber attacks that spill out in the way that NotPetya did, is twofold. Number one, you have NATO that came out early in the war saying Article 5 also applies to cyber operations. Article 5 being an attack against one is an attack against all. And so now if you have a cyber operation that goes after a Ukrainian critical infrastructure node that somehow spills out and affects Poland in the same way, for instance, well, now that's potentially an act of war against NATO, which would trigger Article 5. In the same way as a kinetic weapon would. And so I think Russia has been very explicit in the way they use their cyber capabilities, especially in this war. And because they have the kinetic option, you're just not seeing those same destructive cyber attacks.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Russian cyber actors reining in these operations. I think it's important to talk about that when you discuss these actors, it's not just military organizations or intelligence organizations, but also cyber criminal groups. We saw early in the war, the Conti ransomware group declaring very publicly that they would target anyone going after the Russians in the cyber domain. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the Russia-Ukraine war has changed the cyber criminal threat landscape, specifically as it pertains to targeting of US companies and organizations.
Yeah, and this is an interesting one. Traditionally, when you think of government cyber actors, you're thinking of U.S. Cyber Command or NSA or something along those lines, where it's military or intelligence organizations that are funded by a nation state conducting operations on the order of that nation state, and kind of like a military operation. The difference, though, in cyberspace and really what we've seen as a result of the war in Ukraine is Russia has turned the tables a little bit, and they've done almost in cyberspace what they have traditionally done in the physical space, and that's to also utilize their criminal organizations. That's to leverage non-standard or asymmetric capabilities that they have against traditional targets. And so what I mean by this, where we've seen this rapid increase in ransomware activity, primarily, I think something on the order of 70 to 75% of all ransomware activity occurs from within Russia or from within former Soviet states. The reason behind that is because they're operating with impunity at the tacit approval of the Russian government. And the Russian government in January of last year, actually, just shortly before the war began, they cracked down on REvil and they arrested several of the members. They did that so that they could say, look, we can stop this at any time you want. This is one of our levers of power, and we don't have to. We can allow them to continue operating with impunity and continue to go after your companies, your critical infrastructure, or we can tamp down on it. But the option is yours, Western world. And so that was one of the levers of power. And one of the other things that we've seen really ramp up is hacktivists and grassroots cyber organizations. The one that comes to mind, just because it occurred so recently, is Killnet. Killnet is a group of Russian or Russia-aligned hacktivists with no real central authority other than whoever owns the Telegram account and providing targeting information and instructional materials. But Killnet is basically a group of hackers that will go after organizations that the central authority says these are your target deck. Most recently, those were hospitals and healthcare systems across the West, but primarily in the US. And Killnet ordered all of their group to conduct DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks against hospitals and healthcare organizations. Now, DDoS attacks, by and large, they're not going to cause wide-scale damage to a network. They're kind of a nuisance, but they can, and they can also be a cloak for other things. It can be a cloak to divert the attention of cyber protection teams or cybersecurity personnel who have to deal with that DDoS attack. And now they're taking resources away from protecting against ransomware, in which case you're now dealing with two different things, one of which is much more damaging. But the Russian government, what they have effectively done is said, we are going to use our military and our intelligence and our state-backed cyber capabilities, and we're going to use them as a tool in our war. We're going to use them as a tool to complement what we're doing on the ground. And we are going to allow all of these ransomware groups and the hacktivist groups to do what we otherwise can't do. And so by Killnet targeting healthcare and targeting hospitals and clinics and everything within the healthcare sector, that is a foreign entity or foreign organization targeting US critical infrastructure. But as we talked about before, Russia now has that deniability to say, we're not directing them what to do. This is not a state-sponsored attack. Therefore, this isn't escalatory, despite the fact that Killnet is showing they can target companies, they can target critical infrastructure, they can really target the soft underbelly of our cyber defenses at will, and they are willing to do so.
That's great. And you've talked about kind of the nation state evolution from the war in Ukraine, looking at more targeted, almost scalpel-like attacks in the cyber domain to scope the targets that are impacted by the effects. And then the rise of these cyber criminal activities that are more widespread, but provide a level of separation between the Kremlin and the effects of those operations. How have these evolutions in tactics and techniques changed the threat environment for American critical infrastructure? What should folks on the call be looking to in 2023 within the threat environment as they progress through the year?
Well, I think it's really important for companies to recognize that everything is connected. And so we talked a little bit before about KillNet when they started targeting hospitals. That was in response to something. That wasn't just KillNet saying we are going to go, we're going to hit hospitals with DDoS today. That seems like a good idea. In fact, that was in response to the US, Germany, and the UK promising to deliver main battle tanks to Ukraine in direct support of their military operations on the ground. And so the tit for tat there that you get is now, as a result of something that is occurring in the geopolitical realm, something where the US and partner and allied countries are providing military support to Ukraine, you now have a hacktivist group or this grassroots movement that is going to target critical infrastructure and target commercial or private organizations within the US, UK, and Germany. And so for companies within critical infrastructure in particular, need to be aware that number one, they're on the battlefield. Just first and foremost, if you operate critical infrastructure, really if you operate any network, you need to consider yourself on the battlefield and a part of the battlefield. And you need to really understand geopolitically what is going on and how that might affect your interests, your networks, your company, your critical infrastructure organization. When it comes to these hacktivists and criminal groups, it's the same thing that you would do to protect your network from a criminal organization. So you need to have the basic cybersecurity hygiene. You need to have an incident response plan in place. You need to practice that incident response plan. But it's general awareness of what's going on, not just for the CISO of a company, not just for the COO or the C-suite, but everybody within the organization needs to know what their role is. Sometimes that's training, cybersecurity awareness. It's knowing how to spot phishing emails because, oh, by the way, something like 80% of all malware is delivered via phishing email and it's user error. But also, what happens when an incident occurs? Because what you don't want to have happen is the first time you're practicing your incident response plan to be when an incident occurs. So companies need to be doing tabletop exercises. They need to be dusting off their incident response plan, looking through it, ensuring that it still complies with regulation, ensuring that it actually makes sense for the threat that their sector is focusing, given what's going on geopolitically.
I'll even add one more layer to that as well, if you don't mind, which is
Please.
making sure that incident response plan is well integrated into the rest of the business and its business continuity strategies. Too often, I think we come across organizations in our respective lines of work that may have incident response plans that are siloed, perhaps, from the rest of the business. And so breaking out of that silo and recognizing that a cyber crisis or incident potentially stemming from Russia is no longer going to remain solely in the IT world. It's going to impact other areas of the business, and bringing those people to the table ahead of time builds that resilience, trains your team in their roles and responsibilities to provide them a better defense against such attacks.
And Steve, I'll even add one more to that, because we're focusing entirely on attacks against companies or against their networks. What else is a company reliant on? I mean, if you're in the healthcare sector, certainly you're concerned about what's going to happen if your hospital is targeted or your clinic or your whatever, if you're targeted. Well, what happens if the electric grid that you rely upon goes down? What is it? Because that's not a cyber issue for you in particular. It's a cyber issue for the electric grid, but you rely on that. And so how long can your generators last for? What type of critical functions are you absolutely reliant on the electric grid for, which by and large, everything. If the electric grid goes down, what else does that mean? Where does water go? Where does communications? What happens to your Wi-Fi? What happens to your patient records, your patient database? And so all of these things that you need to start to think through when you consider what are the overall risks if a key piece of critical infrastructure goes down. Is my organization prepared to deal with that? And it may not be that that organization is the one that's being targeted. I'll even throw one more out at you. In late last year, we saw the Russians go after the undersea natural gas pipeline in the Baltic, I believe, the Baltic Sea. And that caused significant issues, but it wasn't a showstopper. But I mean, there was a shortage of natural gas. That same type of capability can be deployed against undersea cables, which, oh, by the way, the internet isn't just this magical thing that goes up to satellites. The vast majority of our communications, something like 90% of our communications, actually traverses these undersea cables that are no thicker than a garden hose. The Russians have a capability to sever those at will. if the Russians decide that this is the end game and we are going to sever communications because we don't want to conduct a kinetic strike, but we want to ensure that there is turmoil in the financial sector, and they cut communications, what does that mean for your organization? Can your organization function with limited communications, with limited access? And what is your backup? What's your plan? So thinking through those types of things, I think, is really important.
Yeah, it's mapping out the relationships and the dependencies of your organization, in whatever sector, to identify, if the Russians hit a third-party vendor, right? What exposure does your organization, does your team have based off that attack? And then, like you said, where are the redundancies at? Where are you building that resiliency in? How are you training your team to speed up the tempo of response so that you can contain and mitigate the impacts of that attack as quickly as possible? And so I know we've talked a lot, or almost exclusively, about the Russians in the cyber domain so far, but I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about how Russian activities in the cyber domain compare to those of other nation state competitors to the United States, the Chinas, the Irans, and the North Koreas, who are concurrently operating within cyberspace, but potentially with some nuanced differences to the Russians. Would you mind kind of diving into that?
Yeah, and this is a great question. It's really important to recognize that each threat actor, and when I say threat actor, each nation state is a little bit different. It's not just everybody has, the hooded hacker in the basement that's going after critical infrastructure. Each one has different motivations. Each one has different goals. They have different TTPs, and quite frankly, they have different capabilities. So where Russia is primarily seeking to sow fear and undermine Western interests so that it can maintain its asymmetric capabilities, let's be frank, Russia's GDP is equal to that of Texas. And so Russia, when we say is a world power, well, why is Russia a world power? Well, they're a nuclear power, and they're willing to do things that other countries, frankly, are not willing to do. They're willing to invade a sovereign nation. They're willing to deploy destructive malware, destructive ransomware, conducts destructive cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, and they've displayed that time and time again. And so they are a significant threat, certainly. But what is their motivation? Well, they want to make sure that people are aware that they're a threat. They want to make sure nations are off balance when trying to deal with them, because you have to treat them almost as a rogue state. Well, Chinese cyber operations are different because the Chinese aren't trying to do the same thing. They're not trying to paint themselves to be an asymmetric power. Chinese cyber operations are geared almost entirely to supplant the US as a world leader, which is one of the Chinese government's goals in all things. Whether it's economics, whether it's academia, whether it is military capability, that's the goal. They want to be the world leader. And so their cyber operations necessarily go towards that goal. And Chinese cyber actors are focusing their effort on economic espionage, theft of intellectual property, large-scale data theft. I mean, think of Equifax or Marriott or the Starwood breaches. Literally hundreds of millions of Americans had their data stolen by Chinese actors, verifiable. And we look at that as, it's like, well, suddenly we almost become numb to it because it's just a data breach. It's not a destructive cyber operation. It's not taking down our power grid. But at the same time, at a certain point, there is, quantity has a quality all its own. And when you have this number of data breaches, suddenly that amount of information about individuals or about companies or intellectual property really does turn the tables on what's the balance of power geopolitically, or what's the balance of power in the world. And so that's not to say that China isn't placing backdoors in critical infrastructure or isn't pre-positioning tools in American systems. It's only to say their MO has largely been data focused and pushing towards their goal. Iran, likewise, is a little bit different from that as well. They use their tools for everything from espionage to destructive cyber attacks against businesses and critical infrastructure to defacing websites that are contrary to the regime. There are destructive cyber attacks that we've seen and we're aware of. They include targeting a dam in New York. That was one of the first attacks against critical infrastructure. Now, it was the wrong dam, and it was much smaller than they think they anticipated. But that was critical because, or critical because they targeted critical infrastructure, but it was significant. Another one was the Las Vegas casinos that were targeted because the proprietor was advocating taking, kinetic action against the Iranian regime. North Koreans are similarly different. Their MO, rather than being, focusing on critical infrastructure or espionage, they're looking at revenue generation. And why? Well, they are a pariah state. They're very poor, as in they don't have the revenue because of all of the UN sanctions that have been on them for years. And they need to continue to develop their WMD and their nuclear capabilities in order to keep the world off balance. And so one of the ways they do that is the Lazarus Group, which is one of the most famous, but they conduct cryptojacking. They go after cryptocurrency exchanges. They do bank heists, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not to say they don't have other capabilities. And WannaCry was a ransomware that was created by a North Korean hacking group. North Koreans attacked Sony Pictures after or shortly before the Seth Rogen movie, The Interview, came out back in 2014. So they have the capabilities. It's just what is the intent, what's the motivation? And each one is a little bit different. And it's good, on a conceptual level to understand that. But from a network owner's perspective, who's attacking you is kind of irrelevant. It's just somebody is attacking you. And so the playbook for that always comes back to, are you resilient? Do you have a plan in place? Are your cybersecurity defenses up to speed? And if you're checking off all those boxes, it's interesting to talk about what the different motivations are. But at the end of the day, you're just trying to protect your network.
And it's also not static, right? These motivations are not set in stone for these countries too, which you already talked about how geopolitical events can drive themes, actions, tactics, techniques, procedures within the cyber domain. Let's look at China right now. They prioritize stealth in their activities and their operations, right? Whether it's for IP theft or potential cybersecurity or cyber surveillance in their targets. But if something, if conflict were to kick off between the US and China, there's a possibility we could see them shift towards more of that destructive tactic that we see the Russians try to use in Ukraine. So again, it's an understanding of keeping the pulse of the geopolitical landscape and then assessing how that impacts the cyber domain as well to really get that focused picture and perspective on what the threat looks like and what that landscape looks like.
No, I agree completely. And understanding that every country has its own cyber capabilities, whether they're asymmetric, as in, Venezuela has a cyber capability, right? It's what is their end state? What is the goal behind why they would be conducting cyber attacks? And it may be intellectual property theft. It may be something where they're using it as a tool of statecraft so that they understand what the next round of sanctions are going to be, or how they could potentially undermine that, or to get a better seat at the table when they are negotiating oil contracts. But for whatever the case may be, each country has a cyber capability. It's how are they going to use it? And more importantly, how is it going to affect individual network owners?
Absolutely. And I'll take this moment to also take a quick pause as we step into the latter half of our discussion here and remind the audience, please submit any questions you have in the chat. Kara will collect those, and then at the tail end of our discussion, we'll turn to those questions and address those in the order that they came in. So, Mike, we've talked about Russia, we've talked about cyber criminals, we've talked about other nation states and how they're evolving their operations in the cyber domain. How has that driven cyber insurance companies, specifically to the United States? How has it driven them to rethink how they approach coverage in the industry? I think one of the big things that are on people's minds is that the beginning of next month, end of March, Lloyd's of London will require state-backed cyber war exclusion clauses for its cyber policies. How has this past year of warfare between Russia and Ukraine, as well as cyber operations elsewhere around the globe, changed how cyber insurance is approached within the American business landscape?
Yeah, and this is an interesting question, and it's one I actually get quite frequently from clients. And it's the question is always, do I need cyber insurance? Is it something that's really necessary? And quite frankly, now my standard answer is yes, absolutely. You want to offset as much risk as you can, but And the reason behind that is cyber attacks can really target companies of all sizes. And cyber insurance is really important because it does offset that risk. But companies need to look at what is their risk landscape, or what is their overall risk to their business from a cyber attack, and is the amount of money they're going to put forward that they could potentially lose from third-party losses, from all sorts of different things. Are they able to withstand that? Are they able to stay afloat if they get hit by a cyber attack? And if they say no, then absolutely get cyber insurance, because it's your lifeblood at that point. You're thinking to yourself, it's not just offsetting risk, but it's making sure that you're able to stay viable, you're able to stay afloat. The vast majority of traditional business insurance policies, and this is really important, the vast majority of traditional business insurance policies are only going to cover physical damage that's caused by a cyber attack. And so that means, like, the computers, your network devices, things that are, if they are actual, turned into bricks, your insurance company will replace those. But what about the data? And this is kind of the critical part, because a lot of companies, especially data-driven companies, that data is your secret sauce. That data is what helps you to stand apart from your customers. If you have unique data sets that tell you, like if you're in the oil and gas industry, and the data that you have based on years of collecting data about customer usage, about the flow rate of oil through pipelines at different temperatures or with different environmentals, all of those things give you an advantage over your competitor, and they make it so you can be more efficient. They make it so your profit margin is greater. Well, all of that data, if that goes away, that's not covered by traditional insurance policies. You basically start from zero and you get nothing for that. Cyber insurance policies, depending on how it's written, could potentially compensate you for loss of that data. And so that's one of the kind of the crucial things is to consider. It's what is not just the physical aspect of it, but what else could I potentially be at risk, or what else could I potentially need to pay for in the event of a cyber incident. Another one's reputational damage. And reputational damage is something that's hard to quantify, but if you're a publicly traded organization or publicly traded company, and you get hit with a cyber attack, and it's very clear that as a direct result of this cyber attack, that your share price dropped significantly. Well, that's partially reputational damage. How do you compensate? How do you put a number to that? And who should bear the risk of that? If you have insurance, you can potentially offset that risk. And so there are other things that need to be considered when talking about third-party claims. The Lloyd's stance kind of adds a little bit of a wrinkle to all of this, and their position that they're just flat out not going to cover acts of war. That's not necessarily something new, but that's a result of NotPetya. And Merck is facing that right now. They have a $1.7 billion claim to Zurich Insurance, which Zurich is saying, well, look, NotPetya was declared by multiple countries to be a direct attack by the Russian government against a country that it was at war with. That's an act of war. This is not covered. The fact that you weren't in Ukraine, the fact that it spilled out and hit your networks globally is irrelevant. And therefore, we are not subject, or we're not required to pay this claim because it was covered by that act of war exception. And it's going back and forth in the courts right now. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But one of the ways Lloyd's is trying to get over that is to say, well, look, we're just not going to cover these. Like, flat out, we are going to put it in black and white. If this is a nation state that conducts a cyber attack and you have damages or liabilities as a result of that, that's on you. This coverage doesn't take care of it. Now, that's kind of a problem. But when I talk to clients, they say, well, look, Lloyd's isn't going to cover it anymore. Our cyber policy isn't going to go, protect us from an act of war. My immediate response to them is, are you really concerned about the Russians? I mean, is Russia targeting your business really a primary concern of yours? Because your property coverage right now, your typically your business insurance coverage is not going to protect you from Russia launching a missile that blows up your warehouse or that blows up your factory, but it will cover it if you have an arsonist that comes in and burns it down. So which one are you more concerned about, the Russians or the arsonist? And anybody who says, well, I'm more concerned about the Russians, they're lying. They're not. They're more concerned about that one-off, that actor that comes in and causes damage. And your insurance policy is going to cover that. Well, in the same way, a cyber insurance policy, while it may not protect you against a cyber attack conducted by a nation state, it is going to protect you against cybercrime. It is going to protect you in large part against ransomware. So that's where you need that cyber insurance. And it's critical. And I always impress this upon clients and just anybody I'm talking to. If you're on the fence about getting cyber insurance, you should be on the fence because you're not sure that it's necessarily worth it to you. Basically, you're in a squeeze, you're not able to afford it, and the probability of you getting hit with a cyber attack is so low that you're willing to take that risk with your eyes open. It shouldn't be because, well, the Russians, if the Russians target me, then I'm not going to be covered. That shouldn't come into your calculus. That's not really what the insurance is for.
Yeah, and I'll double down on that too and say it's incredibly important to take that threat-based approach to these decisions, and that decision all the way starting from how do you set up a cybersecurity program, what controls do you put in place, all the way to how much cyber insurance coverage is best for your organization. To your point, not every business needs to defend themselves against nation-state backed advanced persistent threats in the cyber domain, right? Their most likely threat actor might be that hacktivist, right? So are they putting the right controls in place? Are they allocating their resources appropriately? Are they requesting the right coverage in their policies based off that assessed threat picture? I think that's really important.
And if you're curious about what all is covered under your insurance policy, you should call an outside attorney who's familiar with cyber insurance. Shameless plug.
Shifting a little bit into the mitigation conversation. So the White House is expected to release its national cyber strategy as early as later this week, potentially next week. While drafts have not yet been made available to the public, the rumor is, as of right now, that it will focus on cybersecurity mandates for organizations, for industries, as well as deeper collaboration between government and the private sector on cyber threat intelligence, like that provided by InfraGard, shameless plug on my end, as well as investment in long-term technologies for America, such as artificial intelligence and quantum-proof encryption. I know you were interviewed recently regarding Q-Day. Would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But what should companies expect regarding policies and the regulatory environment coming out of Washington, D.C., as well as state capitals in 2023? And how can they start to prepare now to meet both cybersecurity and compliance requirements?
Yeah, so to forecast, it's always tough to forecast what requirements or what's going to be in what's going to come down the pike, because in large part what we've seen is they're event driven. So EO 14028, which was the landmark executive order that came out in 2021, was in large part resulting from the SolarWinds attack. And so now we're looking at it's like, well, what's going to be the next thing that's really going to drive the regulatory changes that we're going to see? And so I think without some major event occurring, I think there are a couple of things we can expect. And so you've got the national cyber strategy that's about to be published. It's any day now. And what is it going to say? What is it going to mean? And then what are the flow downs that are going to occur for federal agencies and federal contractors or organizations that are in highly regulated industries, such as critical infrastructure? We can kind of read the tea leaves a little bit. And so in the past couple of weeks, you've had Chris Inglis, the director of the National Cyber Director, Ann Neuberger, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, and Jen Easterly, who's the Director of CISA, the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency under DHS. They've all written about proposed changes that would make reporting requirements a lot more stringent. Shorten the timeline, increase the amount of data that companies have to provide in the wake of a cyber incident, whether it's ransomware or some type of data breach. But they've all talked explicitly that, look, the government needs more data. We need more information. We need to know what's going on. Otherwise, there's nothing we can do to protect. There's nothing we can do to provide ammunition, so to speak, to US Cyber Command or the FBI to go take down these actors or to go mitigate this threat. The VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, just published a final rule mandating a 1-hour breach notification for all of their contractors and subcontractors, which is an incredibly short time period. It's basically a discovery happens and you discover a breach or an incident. You have 60 minutes to call your contracting officer and tell them about that breach. And that's, incredible. That's the shortest one that I've seen. Most are 24, 72 hours. But nobody batted an eye at it. As in the federal government, there are lots of complaints in the comment process, but in the federal government, everyone looked at it and said, nope, we're dealing with not only protected health information, but protected health information of our veterans. And so there is a heightened standard there. There's a heightened protection that we need to have. And that's moving forward. As of February 24th, if you're a contractor with the Veterans Affairs, you have 1 hour to report a breach, which is significant. So I think that type of thing we now have a precedent for. I would expect that timelines are going to be shortened considerably. And then, as I said, I think you're going to see more information requirements that are coming out that are related to cyber breaches or breaches or data breaches or cyber attacks. Things like audit logs. We want to see your logs now. The federal government is going to want to see those logs. They're going to want to know what the actual activity was. And that the whole idea behind it is the federal government needs to gain better visibility into the trends of cyber events that are targeting critical infrastructure, but it's targeting organizations writ large, whether they're government agencies, contractors, critical infrastructure. And really the only way to gain that visibility under the current legal construct is to require organizations in regulated industries to provide it directly to the government. I mean, the FBI can't just go in and say, give me your logs. The company's gonna say, no, or show me a warrant. NSA likewise, and it can't collect that information. Cybercom can't collect that information. So if we want the FBI to go after ransomware groups and take them down like they did Hive, what do they need? Well, they need more information about the infrastructure that they're using, the IP addresses that they're coming from, their TTPs, their Bitcoin wallets. All that information needs to be shared with the government. And the only way to do that is to mandate reporting.
And a lot of those organizations, such as the FBI, such as CISA, have a lot of resources at their disposal as well for when an attack is happening. Companies can call them, and there's information available to those organizations that can help them respond more effectively, recover more efficiently, and bring them back to business as usual as quickly as possible. So as we kind of shift to the post-war conversation, I mean, I think ideally the Ukraine-Russia war will come to an end this year. So I'd like to close out our conversation, if we could, discussing what happens next. We've talked how both sides of the conflict have drawn kind of freelance cyber actors from across the globe to their cause over the past year, whether it's the Ukraine side or the Russia side. But what happens when those operations die down in that post-war environment? Where do these actors go? What do they do? And how does that further impact the cyber landscape, the cyber threat landscape for critical infrastructure in the US?
This is something I've actually been watching since the outset of the war. And as these hacktivist groups and the grassroots organizations have really come more to the fore, I continue to think that this is probably the most concerning thing that is coming out of this. And it's not so much, I mean, obviously, Russia severing an undersea cable, very concerning. Russia launching a nuke, very concerning. Russia going after critical infrastructure because they view this as an end of days type situation, very concerning. Those are all most dangerous courses of action. Most likely course of action is the war will end. And at some point, whether it's through an overthrow or a coup or whatever, the current Russian regime will be out of power. And there will be a whole lot of these cyber actors and IT professionals who just got used to doing a lot of hacktivism, just got used to going after networks. And quite frankly, I think we have set a very dangerous precedent writ large by allowing this to happen. And for instance, it's not just KillNet. It's not just, on both sides, there are hacktivists, there are grassroots organizations, there are these decentralized hacker communities that are waging cyber warfare against the other side. I mean, obviously you've got KillNet on one side, but you also have the Ukrainian IT army on the other side. You've got Anonymous on the other side. Why is it okay for the Ukrainian IT army to target Russian critical infrastructure? The IT army is it's a group of volunteers from Ukraine and around the world who've banded together to conduct cyber operations against Russia in support of Ukraine. Don't get me wrong, they have my full-throated support, have at it. But why is that okay? And legally, why is that okay? Are we going to see, if there are Americans in it, and the war ends, are we going to see the Department of Justice bring charges against those American hackers who are part of, Ukraine IT Army under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act or any other statute? Probably not, right? I mean, it's just not going to happen. We're just going to let it go. And so what precedent are we setting? Because once the war ends, now you've got all of these cyber actors who have gotten a taste for it. What's their next agenda item? Maybe it's, free the Uyghurs and we're going to go launch cyber attacks against the Chinese government or Chinese critical infrastructure. What does that mean? What are the third and fourth order effects of that? So what's next? I mean, on the one side, I think we've created these super empowered individuals who are likely to continue to conduct unsanctioned cyber operations for causes they believe in, and there are concerns with that. And that's really on the good side. On the other side, in Russia, this is the real problem. Let's say the war ends and Russia, who's already not doing well economically, collapses or goes into a state of significant economic despair. Well, now you have a pariah state whose economy has been completely decimated, is probably forced to pay reparations to rebuild Ukraine. Mind you, Russia has one of the most robust pools of IT and cyber talent of any country in the world. If there are no jobs for those highly skilled individuals, the likelihood of them returning or turning to cybercrime is pretty high. And so I think following the war, you're going to start to see this transfer and this kind of swelling of cyber criminal activity. And you're going to see an increase in lone wolves, you're going to see an increase in hacktivists and criminal organizations like ransomware groups conducting cyber attacks worldwide because they have access to a larger pool of talent. And what does that mean? Well, if you have all these criminal groups, they're going to go after the richest, most lucrative target, and that's the US. So that's my concern with it.
Yeah, I think it's also not just the proliferate or the spreading of talent, right, post-war, but also the proliferation of tools as well. You have these volunteer organizations that have been given access to what previously have been capabilities relegated to nation states alone. And so now that these capabilities have been pushed down to the individual lone wolf level, they can be leveraged by hacktivists that latch on to other causes post-war. I think that brings along its own flavor of chaos to the mix.
No, absolutely. And that's why I would love to see after the war, you have countries, either Ukraine or countries in the West that say, look, these are the cyber capabilities that we deployed, that we used during the war, or that we identified as these are, Ukrainian IT Army or KillNet. These are the tools they've used, and really push to make sure that you have software developers making sure that those vulnerabilities that those tools are exploiting are patched. And those patches get pushed out far and wide because, as you described, those tools, as long as they have vulnerabilities that they can go after, they're going to proliferate. I mean, we still see instances of Eternal Blue being exploited in the wild. And that's still occurring despite Eternal Blue. The last time like a nation state used it effectively was NotPetya in 2017. It's still being used. We're still seeing companies getting targeted by it. There's no reason. There is a patch. So it's going to really be incumbent upon organizations to make sure their patches are updated, that they're using the updated operating system, that they're not using pirated copies of software, which is huge, and that they have a good management program over their cybersecurity, their cybersecurity program.
Absolutely. So as we turn to questions in the last couple of minutes here, I just want to first, Mike, thank you so much for your time, for the conversation. It has been both enlightening and engaging. And then my final shameless plug for the day is that you have a book coming out, set to publish in August, available for pre-order on Amazon, called Battlefield Cyber: How China and Russia Are Undermining Our Democracy and National Security. So thank you, Mike. Really appreciate the discussion.
Thanks, Steve. No, as always, this is great.
Kara, over to you for any questions that have accumulated in the chat.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Steve. We do have some questions that have come in over the course of the last 45 minutes here. So hopefully you can trace your comments back to those timeframes. Let's see. A question about, Mike, that you had mentioned that Russian disruptive cyber attacks against Ukraine have diminished. Have the Russian cyber attacks diminished in the targeting of US NATO countries?
So we haven't necessarily seen a whole lot of state-sponsored cyber attacks against, and when I say, so let me break it down even further. When I say cyber attacks, those are destructive cyber attacks. We haven't really seen destructive cyber attacks being conducted by Russian state-sponsored cyber actors against Western countries, against Western interests. Because primarily a cyber attack, something that's destructive, something that would rise to the level of an act of war, that would trip Article 5, or that would give the US the justification for responding in kind. And so short answer is no, we have not seen that. Interestingly, though, the destructive cyber attacks that we saw in Ukraine, actually going after Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian government organizations, has also dropped. I mean, we saw there was a point at which we were seeing significant destructive attacks going on and occurring to a tune of 22 to 25 a day in January, February of 2022. By week 20 of the war, that went down to 0, and there were almost none. I think it's steadied out. We might see per week, you might see 5 or 6 destructive cyber attacks, but largely that's gone down. And the reason being is because the Russians are resorting more to kinetic attacks, missiles, and drones than they are destructive cyber attacks.
Thank you for that. Next question. As we look to enable zero trust architectures, there's a US government need to rapidly understand tactical implications of a comprehensive and interoperability between high assurance federated identity into modern communications technologies. Would you say that is accurate?
I actually missed the second part of that question, so yes, that's accurate.
All right. Let's see. What kind of suggestions would you give to a small or medium-sized business to try to ramp up their cyber protections, given the evolving cyber threat environment?
Well, you got to make sure you have a lawyer. That's the first thing. No, honestly, if you're a small to medium-sized business, you really have to look at number one, what's your industry? What's your sector? What are the threats to it? What are your regulatory requirements? What's the cost going to be of a breach to you? And so if you're dealing, like if you're healthcare, you're dealing with protected health information. Well, that's pretty significant. If you get hit, you lose patient information. And that there are significant fines that Health and Human Services can levy upon you under HIPAA. If you're critical infrastructure, what does that mean? All of these things. What does it mean if you get hit with a cyber attack? And then you need to look at, well, my risk is X, my potential liability is Y. How do I make sure that my potential liability, or I'm mitigating the risk such that my potential liability goes down significantly, and I'm not putting myself underwater from a financial perspective by overspending on, cybersecurity, defenses, hiring out. I mean, you can hire out and you can build out your own security operations center with the best cyber defense personnel that money can buy. And then all of your profit goes towards that, or you're completely underwater. Or if you're a smaller company, you can identify a really good managed service provider or managed security service provider and have somebody that does SOC as a service, somebody that does a virtual chief information security officer, somebody that is actually there, that knows what they're doing, that's able to monitor the traffic on your network and able to protect your network against, typical standard attacks. At the end of the day, nobody, if you have a motivated nation state, nobody's going to stop them. They're going to get in your network. But that's not who you're trying to stop. You're trying to stop ransomware. You're trying to make sure that you have protections against DDoS. And so I would say, make sure if you can't afford an in-house team, or that just your business model doesn't allow for it, look for a good, viable managed service provider that can provide that for you. Make sure they're reputable. Make sure it's not just Joe's cyber team from down the street. Make sure they're reputable, and make sure that they understand your regulatory environment. And then secondarily, make sure you have an incident response plan. It doesn't matter what size your company is. You need to know what the risks are that your company is facing, and you need to have a plan for how do you deal with those risks? How do you mitigate them? Do you have outside counsel? Again, shameless plug, but attorneys really are important in this, and I'll tell you why in a second. But do you have a plan for when the worst happens? Because what you don't want to have happen is you're the CEO of a small to medium-sized business. You get hit with ransomware. All of your data is locked up. Your personnel don't have access to their computers. You can't function until you get that data back. What you don't want to have happen is that to be the end of your business because you didn't plan well. And so having a plan in place, doing tabletop exercises, making sure your personnel understand what the threats are and how to mitigate them, and everyone's on board because cybersecurity is a team sport. Making sure everybody understands that is really important. And so having companies that specialize in risk management, having attorneys that understand what your regulatory environment is, what your compliance requirements are, all of these things are really important. The other plug for an attorney If you have outside counsel who brings in, say, a risk management company or a cybersecurity vendor to do an audit of your network because you want to identify what those vulnerabilities are, generally, an outside attorney, you're doing that because you're doing it in preparation for litigation, even if the litigation is potential or possible litigation. By doing that, everything that occurs, all of the information that you're gaining from that audit of your network or from that risk mitigation or that risk management company, that's covered under privilege with an attorney, meaning that if a cyber event does happen and you get sued, the likelihood of that information being able to be turned over to the plaintiff goes down almost to zero. And I say almost because there's always the exception, but that information, because it's covered by privilege, now you don't have the records of your audit and what your network looked like before you made all the changes available to the opposing counsel or to the plaintiff, which could potentially reduce your liability even more. So again, shameless plug for cyber attorneys.
I'm also going to give a plug for in your incident response plan to contact your local FBI field office. And if you don't already have a contact at your local FBI field office, you should get one. Every field office has a private sector coordinator, and they can get you in touch with the right person in their office. I know that my name is in hundreds of incident response plans in the DC, Northern Virginia area, because people like to put a name and a phone number there. We have 6 cyber squads at the Washington field office. So depending on who the threat actor is or what the incident is will dictate what squad you go to. So I kind of do that triage and then get you in touch with the case team and supervisor that would address that kind of issue. So we're always happy to come out and share with companies how we respond and what we do and what we would like from you, and also allay any concerns or fears that folks have that we still drive up in big mobile vehicles with SWAT gear and jackets that say FBI and take servers out of buildings. We really don't do that. So that is
don't forget about the dogs. You also bring dogs with you.
All right, next question. I do see that it is the one after the hour too, so this will be the last one to be mindful of everyone's time. As far as attacks on the US electric grid, are there any documented incidents that we have tied to Russian threat actors? And do you see if those, or do you think those attacks will increase in the US?
So I'm trying to be careful here about what I actually can respond with. So short answer is no, none that we are aware of that there have been any significant attacks that have taken down the electric grid or done any significant damage to the electric grid. Let me put it that way. Do I think that is an attack vector? I think, quite frankly, I think the electric grid is probably, as far as critical infrastructure go, not all critical infrastructure is created the same. Some critical infrastructure absolutely relies on other critical infrastructure to function. The electric grid is one of those. And the electric grid, I think, is probably one of the most important critical infrastructure sectors. And the reason being is because everything else relies upon it, whether it's communication or water or healthcare or pick a critical infrastructure sector. I think the bigger threat to the electric grid writ large, quite frankly, is the fact that, number one, it is very disaggregated. And so you have companies that operate the electric grid that are very small companies that are using dated software, dated information technology, dated operational technology that are integrating that where they shouldn't be. And then you have the very large ones. I mean, you've got BG&E, which covers down on several million people, and everything in between. And I think those companies, we need to have some sort of standardization across the cybersecurity requirements for those companies, and we need to make sure that we're auditing it and making sure that each one, that we understand what the cascading effects would be if something goes down, whether it's a server at a specific electric provider, or whether it's like whole scale cascading power outages that occur across California we need to understand how they interact, because whether it's a cyber, whether it's a cyber actor, a Russian cyber actor, or a criminal, or a squirrel that ends up taking down the power grid, the end result is the same. And so having that understanding where the weak points are, and then having backups and having a plan for resilience, I think is the most important thing.
Thanks for that, Mike, and thank you again, Steve. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions today, but there's a lot of positive feedback about the content of this webinar and how timely and relevant it is given the state of the world today. So Steve, Mike, thanks very much. Do either of you have any closing comments to make?
Okay. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion, Steve. I always enjoy talking about cyber things with you, and Kara, it was really great working with you.
Great, thanks so much.
Mike,
sorry,
Steve,
so go ahead.
No, all good. Mike, thanks so much again for being here. And Kara, thank you so much for facilitating. I think this was fantastic.
Great. Well, with that, as I said, the session is recorded. It'll be posted on the portal, which you hopefully will have access to again in the coming weeks. And don't forget to take that survey when you sign off. So hope to see you next time online, and have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks.